Rachel Anthony never made it home that night. It was February 27, 2001, and Rachel, the 50-year-old cashier at Ultimate Liquors in Pine River, Minnesota, was closing up for the night. It seemed like any other evening, but as the clock ticked toward 10 p.m., she stepped outside into the cold to warm up her car. The engine puffed out thick exhaust fumes into the freezing night air, waiting for her to return. But Rachel never came back. The investigation began fast, but in the small town of Pine River, where everyone knew everyone, the case was already feeling more like a haunting mystery than a missing persons report. It wasn't just Rachel who had vanished. It was the sense of safety that Pine River had always taken for granted. For a town with a population of only 900, the idea that something so violent could almost unimaginable. Rachel Anthony wasn't the type of person you'd think of as a victim. She wasn't some random woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was 50 years old, a mother of 3, and had been living in Pine River for just a few years. She worked hard at the liquor store, a job she took seriously, but not for the love of it. It was about keeping the bills paid and making sure her kids were taken care of. Her daughter, Jessica Winch, had been bowling just across the street the night her mother disappeared. The night she could have walked across the street and said hello. But instead, cold and tired, she decided to go home. That decision, something so small, would stay with her forever. It was just a couple of hours later when Jessica's phone rang. The voice on the other end told her everything she feared. Rachel was gone. At first, Jessica couldn't believe it. She demanded answers. "What do you mean she's missing?" she asked, desperate for something that made sense. But when they told her that her mom's purse, coat, and cigarettes were all still there, Jessica knew something was wrong. Her mom would never leave without those things. No way. Rachel was strong, determined, but also practical. She would never walk out into a Minnesota winter without her coat, and especially not without her cigarettes. And so began the frantic search. The next morning, the small town of Pine River was shaken. Police were on the scene almost immediately, but they quickly realized this wasn't going to be a simple case. They didn't have much to work with, and in a town where crime was practically unheard of, the odds of finding Rachel seemed slim. But they worked fast. 50 law enforcement officers were assigned to the case, combing through the area, searching by foot, by air, and by boat. They scoured the river, hoping maybe Rachel had wandered off or slipped in the cold. Divers were sent into the dam. Nothing. There was no sign of her. Every lead they followed, every road they searched, led to more dead ends. The only thing they could hold on to was the feeling that this wasn't an accident, that Rachel hadn't simply wandered off. She had been taken. As the investigation stretched on, the clues grew colder. The patrol officer who had passed by her car noticed something strange. Rachel's car had been left running. Something she would do, sure, but why wasn't she inside? And when he passed by later in the night, the car was still there, still running, but no Rachel. At the store, they found her things, her purse, her coat, her cigarettes. The cash register wasn't opened, which ruled out robbery, but Rachel was gone, vanished. Then came the chilling realization. Rachel had been abducted. It was the only explanation that made sense, and yet it didn't. The back door of the store was unlocked, but the front door was locked tight. Had Rachel been forced out through the back? Who could have taken her, and why? In the weeks that followed, Jessica couldn't escape the feeling of guilt. Every night she replayed that moment when she sat in her car across the street from the store. Should I have gone inside? Should I have said hello? Maybe if I had, this wouldn't have happened. The what-ifs haunted her. But what was worse was the feeling of helplessness. She couldn't change what had happened, and now she had to live with the question that burned at her. Why was Rachel taken, and who was responsible? Days turned into weeks, and with every passing moment, the town of Pine River seemed to lose a little more of its innocence. The police worked tirelessly, but the case seemed to stall. Every lead was a false trail. But as the cold of winter began to recede, something unexpected happened. April 13th, Friday the 13th, a day that would forever be linked to tragedy. 4 teenagers, out riding their horses along Nielsen Road, a secluded gravel path just outside Pine River, made an unsettling discovery. They saw what looked like a mannequin lying in a ditch. It wasn't until they got closer that they realized the horrifying truth. It wasn't a mannequin. It was a body. The body was Rachel Anthony. For Jessica, it was the nightmare she'd been dreading, but now it was real. It was her mother. It had been nearly 2 months since Rachel had disappeared, and now the small town was plunged back into darkness. Rachel's body was found nearly 15 miles south of Pine River, in an isolated area that only locals were familiar with. How had she ended up there, and why? The body was found in a state of severe decomposition. Investigators knew immediately that Rachel hadn't been killed recently. She had been dead for weeks, and yet no answers, no leads, no suspects. But the discovery was crucial. It was the break they needed. DNA recovered from the body would offer a key to finding the killer. The hope was that this evidence, combined with the right tip, would finally give them something solid to go on. Yet, as the investigation pressed on, one question remained unanswered. Who had done this to Rachel? Jessica couldn't stop herself from wondering if the killer was someone local. Someone who knew her mom, or someone who knew the town well enough to strike without being noticed. But the more she thought about it, the more she found herself circling back to the haunting possibility. It could have been anyone, and that thought terrified her. As Rachel's body was taken for examination, the town of Pine River was left grappling with the loss of someone they had never expected to be taken. And yet, even though her body had been found, the truth still seemed elusive. The more they searched, the more questions emerged. How could Rachel have ended up in such an isolated spot? Was she killed nearby, or was her body dumped there after the fact? For investigator Michael Dykman, the case felt like a personal mission. This wasn't just another cold case to be ticked off a list. Rachel's disappearance had rocked the small community, and Dykman knew that everyone was watching, waiting for answers. But every time he thought he had a lead, it fizzled out. The town had no history of violent crimes, and Rachel had no known enemies, no obvious motive, no clear suspect. The DNA recovered from Rachel's body was the only real clue they had. The database would be their best shot at tracking down her killer, but the process was slow, meticulous, and frustrating. Every potential match had to be carefully examined, ruled out, or confirmed. As the days turned to weeks, Dykman kept going back to one lingering question. Could the killer be someone from Pine River? As Jessica grappled with the reality of her mother's murder, she found herself haunted not just by grief, but by the unknown. Every corner of her mind was filled with the image of her mother being taken, dragged away, helpless, perhaps even knowing her time was up. Jessica remembered how her mom had always been strong. Rachel didn't shy away from challenges, no matter how big. Could it have been someone she'd trusted? A regular customer who took things too far? Or was it someone who had been watching her, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike? The idea of a stranger targeting her mother seemed impossible. But the more Jessica thought about the circumstances of Rachel's abduction, the more she considered the possibility that Rachel had been taken by someone who knew how to navigate the town's quiet streets. Someone who understood its rhythms, its routines. Someone who could slip in and out unnoticed, who knew the back roads, who knew that the liquor store would be quiet just before closing. Despite the pain, Jessica couldn't stop herself from pushing for answers. Even as the police worked tirelessly, she wanted to know more. What had happened in those final moments? Had Rachel been terrified? Had she fought back? The unknown was a constant, suffocating presence in her life. It was only after months of dead ends that a breakthrough finally came. As the snow melted and the days warmed, the case had become a chilling reminder of how deep the mystery ran. But then, another twist. One evening, Dykeman received a call that would shake everything he thought he knew about the case. A woman had come forward with information. She had been working in Pine River on the night of Rachel's disappearance, and she remembered seeing someone lingering outside the liquor store. She had seen him before. He was a regular customer, but this time he looked different, nervous, agitated. She couldn't place it, but something about him felt off. Was he the last customer Rachel had served that night? The one who had paid in cash? The one who had disappeared without a trace? The woman's memory wasn't crystal clear, but it was enough to get Dykeman thinking. Could this be the breakthrough they needed? The townspeople began to whisper again. Was someone close to them involved? Or was the killer still out there, watching, waiting? The weeks dragged on, and the town's unease grew. Pine River wasn't the kind of place where people worried about murder. But after Rachel's abduction and the discovery of her body, things had changed. People started locking their doors, looking over their shoulders. The silence of the small town was pierced by whispers of suspicion, of who could have done it, of who could be hiding a dark secret. Detective Dykeman had pored over the evidence time and time again. The case had become personal for him too. It wasn't just about finding a killer. It was about finding justice for Rachel, for her children, for everyone in the community who now lived in fear. But with every passing day, the frustration mounted. Rachel's killer was still out there, and the town was on edge, desperately clinging to the hope that the truth would come to light. The police had combed through every lead they could find. They had retraced Rachel's steps in the days before her disappearance. They spoke with her ex-husband, her friends, her co-workers. They'd even gone through the list of every customer who had come into the store that night. But the one person who had paid in cash, Rachel's last customer, had never been found. He didn't show up on any security footage. The cameras at the store had malfunctioned that night, just when they were most needed. The only trace of him was the cash receipt. No name, no face. Just a man who vanished without a trace. But then that small, seemingly insignificant detail, the woman who had seen someone lingering outside the liquor store, changed everything. Dykeman couldn't ignore the feeling that this was the break they needed. That woman's memory, shaky as it was, now became one of their most important leads. If she had seen someone familiar, someone who wasn't supposed to be there, it could change everything. Dykeman immediately started looking deeper into this potential lead. He knew that he had to track down this last customer, the one who had paid in cash. But with so little to go on, he also realized something. The person responsible for Rachel's death wasn't just someone who knew the town. It was someone who had carefully planned this. Someone who knew how to keep a low profile, how to avoid leaving behind any evidence. The back roads, the isolated spot where Rachel's body was found, the lack of tire tracks, the absence of witnesses, everything pointed to someone with knowledge of the area. Someone who had been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. But as the days wore on, Dykeman knew he needed more than just a hunch. He needed solid evidence. And the only way to get that was to track down the last customer, the one who was in the store that night. It became an obsession for Dykeman. He spent hours sifting through records, retracing Rachel's final moments. Meanwhile, Jessica's life was consumed by the need to know what had happened to her mother. The guilt gnawed at her. Could she have done something? Should she have walked over to the store that night, even if it was cold, even if she was tired? It wasn't just the pain of losing her mother that tore her apart. It was the fact that her mother had been taken so violently, without warning, without any explanation, and that she couldn't shake the thought that the killer could still be out there, living a normal life, maybe even watching her. It took a while, but eventually, Dykeman received a tip that led them to a man who had frequented the store around the time of Rachel's disappearance. His name was Thomas Ainsley, a local man with a history of petty crimes. Ainsley wasn't a stranger to the police, but he had always managed to keep his nose clean when it mattered. He was a loner, and his alibi for the night of Rachel's disappearance didn't hold up under scrutiny. Dykeman's team dug into Ainsley's background. They found that he had been living alone in a small cabin just outside Pine River. Ainsley was familiar with the back roads around town, and he had a reputation for lurking around places he shouldn't have been. There was a feeling in the pit of Dykeman's stomach, a gut feeling that told him Ainsley knew more than he was letting on. The investigators brought him in for questioning. He was calm, collected, almost too much so. But there was something off about him. He denied everything. He claimed to have never seen Rachel the night she went missing. He swore he was home all night, though no one had seen him. The DNA found on Rachel's body had yet to be matched to anyone, but Dykeman knew they couldn't let Ainsley slip through their fingers. But Ainsley had something else on his side: silence. He wouldn't speak. Not a word. The more they pushed, the more he clammed up. And that only made Dykeman more determined. This man knew something. Days turned into a blur for Jessica as she waited for answers. The guilt she carried with her weighed heavier with each passing moment. She couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened that night. Was Ainsley the one? Could he have been the last customer Rachel served? The one who had vanished into the cold, dark night without a trace? Meanwhile, the investigation into Ainsley grew more intense. Though his alibi didn't hold up, they still didn't have enough to tie him to Rachel's death. The DNA hadn't matched his, and without solid evidence, they couldn't charge him. The authorities kept him in the hot seat, but without anything concrete, they couldn't make a move. As the investigation dragged on, the pressure on Jessica only increased. She found herself torn between hope and despair. Every new lead seemed to fizzle out. Every new theory felt just as far from the truth as the one before it. She spent sleepless nights scouring through old photos of her mom, reading old messages, hoping to find some clue that might help her make sense of the brutal tragedy. But nothing came close to answering the questions that haunted her every day. Who had done this? Why Rachel? Then, in a twist no one saw coming, Jessica received an unexpected call. It was from a local woman who claimed to have seen something unusual in the days leading up to Rachel's disappearance. She hadn't come forward sooner because she hadn't thought it was important. But now, after everything had happened, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had to speak up. The woman explained that she had seen a car parked behind the liquor store on the evening Rachel had gone missing. The car was black, and it had been parked in an unusual spot, out of sight from the main road. The woman couldn't recall the exact make or model, but she did mention something about the car's license plate being partially obscured by snow. This was a breakthrough. The woman couldn't remember much more, but the fact that there had been a car parked there, hidden in plain sight, seemed like an important piece of the puzzle. Dykeman immediately followed up on the tip, searching through old vehicle records for black cars with partially obscured plates in the area. The search led them to a name they hadn't considered, an old acquaintance of Rachel's who had moved away years ago but had recently returned to town. His name was Frank Miller, a man who had been in and out of Rachel's life for years. He wasn't a regular customer at the store, but he knew Rachel from their shared past. And more disturbingly, he had been spotted at the store shortly before Rachel's disappearance. When they tracked Frank down, his reaction was nothing like they had expected. At first, he was cooperative, but when the questions turned to Rachel, he became defensive. He didn't want to talk about her, and his story didn't match up with the facts. Frank was quiet, almost too quiet, and that made Dykeman suspicious. The DNA on Rachel's body was still the key to cracking this case. A match could confirm Frank's involvement, but until then, he was just another lead. As the investigation into him deepened, Dykeman knew they were getting closer, but they needed more to bring him to justice. As the investigation dragged on, Jessica, still reeling from the endless cycle of false leads, found herself once again staring into the abyss of uncertainty. Was Frank Miller the one who had killed her mother? Was he the man who had taken Rachel on that fateful night, driven her to the isolated spot where her body was found, and ended her life so brutally? The more Dykeman dug into Frank Miller's life, the more questions emerged. Frank had been known to have a temper, and his brief relationship with Rachel had ended on bad terms. He was distant, unreliable, and yet there was still something about him that didn't fit the profile of a killer. But the way he shut down when asked about Rachel, it didn't sit right with Dykeman. He couldn't shake the feeling that Frank knew more than he was letting on. Then, the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. A month after the tip from the woman about the black car, Dykeman received a call. They'd matched the DNA found on Rachel's body. It wasn't a local. It wasn't Frank Miller. It was someone entirely unexpected. The name came back as Jared Pierce, a man with a history of violence recently released from prison. Pierce had been a drifter, never staying in one place, but there had been reports of him in and around Pine River in the weeks leading up to Rachel's disappearance. His criminal record was disturbing, and Dykeman immediately suspected that he could be the one responsible for Rachel's death. Jared Pierce had slipped under the radar for a while, staying just out of sight, blending in with the crowd. But now, with the DNA evidence, they had the smoking gun. He was the one who had killed Rachel. The question was, why? Dykeman and his team worked quickly. They tracked Pierce to a small town not far from Pine River. When they arrested him, he didn't resist. He was quiet, almost relieved that the search was finally over. In the interrogation room, Pierce revealed the terrifying truth. He had been in Pine River that night, but not as a customer. He had been watching Rachel for days. He had been planning his attack. He had been waiting for the right moment. And when Rachel was alone in the store, he saw his chance. Pierce had followed her out into the cold, waiting for her to start her car. When she went back inside, he slipped in through the back, the door left unlocked for the garbage. There, he ambushed her. Rachel fought back, of course. She wasn't someone to go down without a fight, but Pierce overpowered her, and in the end, he suffocated her, leaving her body in the woods, where it would be months before anyone would find her. Jessica couldn't believe it. Her worst fear was true. The man who had killed her mother was someone she had never suspected. The shock of it all hit her hard. The community of Pine River had been shaken to its core, but now, finally, after months of searching and waiting, they had answers. The mystery was solved. The killer was in custody, but the pain and grief that Rachel's family would carry with them would never fade. For Jessica, the relief was bittersweet. She could finally lay her mother to rest, but the scars of this tragedy would never disappear.